Of all the cancer myths we've dealt with, the recently recirculating one that sunscreen is bad for you or causes cancer, and that sunbeds and lots of UV exposure is good for you, is really bizarre and utterly wrong. And it's worth looking into where these myths came from and why they are circulating. Now, I'm going to pull rank a tiny bit, okay? So, a long time ago when I was young, over 10 years ago, I did my PhD thesis right here on ultraviolet radiation. So, I know a little tiny bit about it. And I know enough to know that a lot of the stuff that is going around online that influencers are sharing is dangerously wrong. So, without further ado, let's break some of that down. Straight off the bat, sunburn, or solar erythema, is a form of radiation burn. It is specifically provoked by a certain wavelength of light, usually UVB. You have some reaction from UVA, but it's roughly 100-fold lower. This is called the CIE erythemal action spectrum, if you're very bored and want to know that kind of stuff. But here's the thing, it is a form of radiation damage. And because the body recognizes that, it provokes an inflammatory response to get you the hell out of that sunlight. Because both direct and indirect DNA damage can occur in when you're exposed to UV light. So this is an evolved mechanism to say, hey, get the hell out of the sun. The other evolved mechanisms we have are melanogenesis, where we tan, basically. All of these are warning signs. They are our body's way of reacting to damage, usually thymine dimers, if we're interested in that kind of stuff. But the essential thing to point out is this is radiation-induced damage. Also, your skin doesn't absorb UV radiation very deeply. So this is nothing to do with seed oil. Anyone who tells you this is anything to do with seed oil is talking out their posterior. This is simply not true. Nor is this a form of light therapy, unless you consider radiation damage to be a form of light therapy. It is not. So anyone who's telling you that these falsehoods is misinformed and should not be listened to. The myth that sunscreens are causing skin cancer is really pathetic, and it's a drastic misreading of what the evidence actually tells us. Firstly, unregulated UV exposure is a leading driver of skin cancer, and good sunscreen is incredibly important in reducing that. There are two types of sunscreen. There are barrier methods or mineral methods, and there are organic or chemical methods which absorb some of that UV. Where these people make a misrepresentation of the evidence is there are chemicals in some of the sunscreens that, in high concentrations, might be damaging to humans. But here's the thing, concentration matters. Apples are got arsenic in the core, but you're not going to get arsenic poisoning eating an apple because the dose isn't high enough. And so firstly, it's a misrepresentation of that. The second factor to put in perspective is that risk has to be balanced. The risk of getting a cancer from sunlight exposure, from sunburn, from UV damage is so much higher than a hypothetical risk from a small concentration of a chemical used to absorb UV light. It's kind of like thinking that your seatbelt in your car might decapitate you in an accident, so you shouldn't wear a seatbelt. No, that would be absolutely the wrong way of thinking about it. Yet this is what this stuff pivots on. And again, most of this is based on chemophobia, fear of chemicals, even though everything that you can touch or feel or sense is a chemical, unless you're dealing with just pure light, which ironically is not a chemical because they're photons. So yes, the last kind of character in this rogues gallery are the kind of influencers that will tell you you need to get lots of UV exposure and you need to get sunbeds and you need to get UV because that is the elixir of health. The thing is, they're not right, and they're not even original. This kind of nonsense has been said for centuries, well before we actually understood the mechanisms of DNA damage induced by ultraviolet radiation, and before we understood why we evolved protective effects because it damages us. So they are pivoting on this naturalistic version of, oh, sun exposure is always good to me. Well, no, it's not. This is why people who live in very sunlight intense areas have much darker skin than people who don't. These are evolved mechanisms to keep us alive because ultraviolet radiation damages DNA. There's no two ways about it. You are always better off limiting your exposure. Sunbeds drive up the risk of cancer dramatically. And if you go out in the sun without your sunscreen, you are not getting light therapy, you are getting DNA damage. Sometimes people talk about vitamin D3 synthesis, and that's kind of misleading. People with very white skin have evolved mechanisms of getting more D3 from sunlight, but they also get it largely from diet and supplementation. So, again, it's a risk balance thing. If you go and get massive amounts of UV damage, you can't go, well, I got vitamin D3 too. No, that just doesn't fly. So all of this stuff is nonsense. And it's a really important reminder to be very, very careful about what we believe online. So to conclude, sunlight is dangerous and you need to limit your exposure. Look, as Baz Luhrmann said back in 1999, wear sunscreen. Okay? And don't listen to idiots on Instagram that tell you otherwise. He didn't say that part, but I think it's implied. The other thing, just a final thing to finish up on, people sometimes worry about their sunscreen damaging reefs, coral reefs, and things like that. And look, this is a concentration issue too. Do they? The answer is probably not. So there are chemicals in sunscreen that could, in theory, applied directly to a reef, cause damage. But you are talking parts per trillion even when you wash that stuff into water. Again, doses make it the poison. We've been saying this for a very long time. So the answer is scientifically most likely not. So even that as an argument being used is a pretty weak one. Again, protect your skin. Don't listen to idiots online. Hope this has been useful.